Greetings and welcome to our Fielding Graduate University Annual Veterans Day Acknowledgement event. This event, which is annually held, was an initiative that developed through student efforts. I give special thanks to Christina St. Clair and Caroline Miller, both of whom are Fielding graduate students in the School of Psychology and who have given so much to this project. It is through their efforts and support that we are meeting today. In addition, we are blessed to have a president at Fielding Graduate University who understands the importance of Veterans Day in the lives of each and every one of us. To that end, I would like to introduce President Rogers, who will share her thoughts and reflections about the importance of this acknowledgement of our veteran community. Please, President Rogers.
Thank you, Dr. Davis White-Ice, and thank you all for being here today on this very important occasion. And for all of those who will not be able to be here but will listen to the recording, welcome. Some of you know that my late husband was a military veteran, and he lived through the Vietnam War. So he's older than me, and when we met, he was in active service, and he spent a lifetime and career in the United States Army. He eventually died of exposure to the chemical Agent Orange decades after his service. And I have talked about this in previous Veterans Day events that we've had here at Fielding. And some of you may have read my letter that I sent out yesterday in honor of Veterans Day. But I've also been thinking a lot lately about what it meant to be a military spouse for me, but also for many of the women, often women who are spouses, who support and become the family support for military active duty service, and then also for veterans. Now, that has been traditionally the case. But one of the things that my husband Bill talked a lot about was how the military changed dramatically throughout his lifetime of service. So he began as an 18-year-old in the infantry in 1961, and he finished his service almost 1990, so quite some time. And he had taken a stint out of the service for a short period. And over the course of that time, he saw dramatic, sweeping changes in the military. And one was the ways in which women's leadership grew within the military, that despite a lot of misogyny and difficulty, women began to be seen as a critical component of active military. And he was very proud of the growth of women's leadership in the military during his time of service. And he was very much an advocate of that. And I think about that today when I think about the panel that we're going to talk about, and the different experiences that our panelists have had with military service or working with military and their families. I also think about it in terms of the support systems that have improved over these last decades for women, both if as a spouse, but also in active duty, and also the ways in which we're still evolving. This is still a work in progress, and I know some of this because I have the benefit of being able to access support services even now, although my husband has passed, and how critical those have been, and how critical it's been for me to have connections, friendships, relationships, and support from other women who have military experience, even directly or as a spousal support unit, as we would like to say. So for me today, I'm telling you this personally because this is such an important aspect of who we are as people, that we bring our whole selves to Fielding. And it wasn't until I came to Fielding that I realized how important my own personal experience as a military spouse also impacted the way I thought about research questions, my scholarship, my passion for education and learning, that we bring everything to the table when we are manifesting or growing into our own learning as scholars and as practitioners. And so to me, I'm grateful for you, Dr. Davis White-Ice, and for everyone on this call who are taking the time to make a space to discuss deeply the experiences of what it is like to be a woman in the military or connected to the military, and also how we can use these experiences and use this learning together to think about the ways in which systems of support can be improved and how we can, as human beings, apply the behavioral and social sciences to creating a better world for others. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you and let us begin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, President Rogers. Those were wonderful words, and I think such a lovely way of encapsulating what today's event is really all about. Our hope is that today's event will illuminate some of the different ways that women experience military service and emphasize how these professional and personal experiences and observations may impact clinical work. So important, really aligns with what President Rogers shared. We ask that all of you as our audience save your questions and drop them in the chat for our panelists. Our moderators will curate your questions, and additionally, we will be recording this event and posting it to our Fielding YouTube. Please be reminded that our Fielding offices will be closed on Monday, November 11th, in observation of Veterans Day. And so with that, let me introduce our panelists for you. Caroline Miller is our first panelist. She has an MA and will be discussing both her experience as a woman in the profession within a military capacity and any gendered trends challenges she has professionally observed, along with clinical responses to these trends. Our second speaker will be Captain Megan Hager, who will discuss gender-based barriers to ongoing treatment for female veterans, along with many of the unique trends that she has observed in contemporary clinical treatment for this population. And our last speaker will be Dr. Shaina Townsend. She will be asked to discuss how her experience in the military shaped her clinical journey, as well as the barriers to social support or other support she has observed or experienced since separating from the military that may be beneficial for practitioners to learn from. So with that, let us begin with Caroline Miller.
Hi, thank you guys so much. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As stated, my name is Caroline Miller. I am a Fielding student. I'm also the Division 19 Student Chapter Representative. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very excited to be a part of this event. And I actually thought I would begin today by providing a brief overview of the history of women in the military. So my hope is to really frame the rest of the conversations we're having today about those contemporary challenges and the realities of female service members and female veterans within this broader historical context. So if you will indulge me, I thought I would actually start with my own military history. So I am actually a third generation military veteran. The handsome gentleman you see on the left there is my grandfather. He served in World War II in the Army Air Corps, which does predate the Air Force. The lovely woman in the middle is my mother. She served during the Vietnam War, and she was also in the Air Force. And there I am on the right-hand side. I served as a medic in the Air Force from 2012 to 2016. Quick note about this photo. This was taken during a combat medic training exercise. So the gentleman in the back is an actor, obviously a very convincing one. But despite the intensity of this photo, nothing terribly dramatic is actually happening. It is just one of my favorite photos from my time in the service. So in addition to my mother and I, women have been serving in the military for over 200 years. Beginning in the Revolutionary War, women accompanied men on the battlefield, performing a number of important duties, including weapons cleaning and providing medical aid. Some women even dressed as men, concealing their gender and engaging in combat. Now, we don't have an exact number of how many women did this, but there are a few kind of better known stories of women concealing their gender in this manner. And I encourage you to look those up because they're very compelling. Then during the Civil War, over 3,000 women served as nurses for the Union Army. One notable nurse, a name that we might recognize, is Clara Barton. She was allowed to bring her medical wagon directly onto the battlefield, tending to the wounds of other soldiers in the midst of battle. Clara Barton, of course, went on to later found the American Red Cross. In addition to working in a medical capacity, an estimated 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and fought on both sides during the Civil War. Then in 1901, the Army Nursing Corps was founded, and by 1918, over 3,000 women were deployed to France and Great Britain, working in military hospitals during World War I. This was the first time that women were allowed to openly serve in the military. So in an attempt to fill roles and jobs stateside, the U.S. Navy found a loophole that allowed women to enlist, working primarily in clerical jobs, though the U.S. Army Signal Corps also enlisted women who worked as switchboard operators. Now, important note here, this actually predated the passing of the 19th Amendment. So women were actually serving in the military before they had the right to vote. By World War II, women were allowed to openly serve in all military branches, and over 350,000 women served in uniform during this conflict. These women filled a variety of roles, including working in clerical positions, repairing aircraft, flying test aircraft, and even training male pilots in air combat maneuvers. An additional 68,000 women worked in the Army or Navy Nursing Corps during this conflict, and a total of 432 women were killed in the line of duty during World War II. In 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which officially allowed women to serve as permanent and full members of all military branches. While this act was still quite discriminatory in other ways, it did remove many of those barriers to military service. And when the Korean War began just 2 years later, 120,000 women served in active duty positions. During the Vietnam War, over 11,000 women were stationed in Vietnam, the majority of whom worked as nurses. And during this war, in addition to filling some of those more traditional roles in the military, women were working as air traffic controllers, intelligence officers, and in the case of my mother, electronic countermeasure systems analysts. During the 1980s, women continued to serve in a variety of positions. And when the Gulf War began, over 40,000 women deployed to combat zones during the first year alone. Now, women were not actually allowed to serve in direct ground combat until 2015. So prior to this, women were still engaging in combat in both the air and sea. A quick note here before we move on, all of the photos you see are courtesy of the Library of Congress. So if you'll indulge me once more, I have selected another photo of mine from my time in the service, and that's what you see here on your slide. So today, women make up an estimated 17% of our military forces and work in a broad range of combat and non-combat positions. As you may have sensed as we went through that very brief history, an enduring challenge women face in the military is gender-based discrimination. So from those early years when women were not allowed to join the military to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when women were required to separate if they became pregnant, to only being allowed to engage in direct ground combat less than a decade ago, the history of women in the military is really characterized by a very pervasive organizational discrimination. Because of this, many military women still report experiencing things like ambivalent sexism, conflicting social standards and expectations, and an overall less sense of social and organizational support. I actually once personally described my experience in a publication as, quote, "The ubiquity of sexism in military culture is something that is hard to fully put into words. It is rarely something tangible, and it's not always even present in words or actions. It's just this unspoken knowledge that we carry this acceptance rooted in a history of oppression that women don't belong." Now, of course, this experience of otherness was not always present in every interaction, but for me, I felt like the knowledge was sort of still there. Additionally, women endure a disproportionately higher rate of sexual violence in the military. This has become known as military sexual trauma, a term that we have almost all certainly heard before. MST leads to a variety of adverse psychological outcomes and challenges. The military has increased attention and funding to combat MST and decrease sexual violence through things like expanding training programs, criminalizing sexual harassment and not just sexual assault, and removing barriers to reporting. However, this continues to be a significant problem for military members and especially female service members. So as we discuss enduring challenges for military women, no conversation would really be complete without acknowledging the pervasiveness of gender-based discrimination and MST. So this actually concludes my portion my portion of the event. As I said, I really just wanted to provide a very brief history of women in the military
Oh, no, the headphones aren't working.
to help frame the rest of the conversation. So now I would like to turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline. And I think at this time we go to Captain Hager.
And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I know I'm in the beautiful state of Alaska, so it is morning to me for at least the next few hours, and then we will go into darkness. Thank you guys. I just wanted to express my gratitude for being a part of this panel and being able to be here with y'all. I know Caroline and I've worked very closely together at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and so when she had asked me about being a part of the panel, I was absolutely overjoyed, especially just to kind of describe my journey. I am still currently active duty. I'm a clinical psychologist, currently stationed here at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. I completed my doctorate at George Fox University in Newberg, Oregon. It's been a couple of years now since that's happened. Part of what I like to share kind of just in my journey and how I came in is to want to try and beautifully align it with what Caroline was sharing, just the experiences I've had, what I've seen clinically. I do come from a military family. Grandfather served, and my mother has worked for the VA for 30 plus years. So being a part of the military community has always been a part of my life. And at some point in time, as I'm sure all of those who are in grad school know, when we get practicums, there's some practicums that just touch us in different ways and can very much realign us to a different career trajectory than we thought. And for that, for me, was Cedar Hills Hospital in Beaverton, Oregon, which is an inpatient psych facility. They have a very specific military unit there, and I had the absolute pleasure to be able to work with them. And it wasn't until working with them for a year, I started talking with veterans, active duty, dependents, spouses, children of military members that kept saying, you know, had I had this level of treatment while I was in the military, I don't know if I would have resulted in what I'm dealing with now, be that variety of PTSD, comorbid disorders, especially when it comes to alcohol, substances. And I said, well, you know, I don't know what it looks like to go and serve in the military, so let's go see what that is. And I was very fortunate. I was granted the Health Professional Scholarship, which looks like I come into the military, and they are very gracious and help pay for a few years in my grad school in exchange that I end up having an active duty service commitment. So I commissioned in 2019 and finished out grad school. And as soon as I got done, I went off to officer training school. And that day I was given the wonderful rank of captain, and I was off to residency and learning not only how to be a full-blown psychologist with no training wheels on. Supervision was a little bit more limited with all the fun imposter syndrome on top of having to learn how to be an officer in the military. It's been wonderful. And so since then, I'm coming up on my almost 6 years in the military, and wouldn't have it any other way. It's been great. I will say that as I've traversed this, I am married. I've been married for almost 6 years and with my spouse for almost 11. So poor guy, yeah, high school sweethearts. I know, sweet guy. And we just welcomed our brand new baby boy less than 3 weeks ago. So if you hear some crying in the background, I apologize. We're in the newborn trenches. But I think what I found so wonderful about the experience is traversing this demographic, especially as a military member, a woman in the military, and you know, how does this look? How do we get healthcare? How do we advocate for ourselves, especially being in the role that I am in? I am predominantly seeing patients anywhere from 6 to 10 hours a day, and having to make sure that we're focusing on, we got to get them back in the fight, and while balancing, hey, I've got a family, I've got things that I need to make sure are there. And so sometimes that can have its challenges. And I would definitely say that in the grand scheme of the conversation about some of those, the things that Caroline had touched on, that noticing that in my time of coming in, there was definitely those moments where, I'd approach someone and they'd say, oh, are you military or do you have veterans? And I said, yes. And they said, okay, what does your spouse do? And it's the automatic assumption that my husband is the military member, it's not me. And just an interesting dynamic. And then being asked, well, what do you do? And when you say medical or something like that, they go, oh, okay. That makes sense. That makes sense that you're medical. Full well being aware that we work with a lot, and I'm going to speak a little bit for you, Caroline. We work a lot with women that are maintainers, and they're flyers, like people who work in a very, very high demand, very high vis, what we call line side jobs. And just knowing that the assumption is that when you say you're a military member or spouse, at least in my experience, that it automatically is my spouse that is the military member, not myself. And it's definitely, I will say that in the scheme of therapy and what we see from a client perspective, as Caroline touched on, MST is a very predominant and very pervasive issue. I will say over the last several years, I have started to see an increase and actually more awareness with our male counterparts more as well, but definitely it continues to be very persistent for our females, and a very noticeable trend that we've continued, or at least I've seen in my clinical work, is it's been years, they've served 10, 15 plus years, and it's now just at this time as they're getting ready for retirement, they're going, I've been bottling this up. Now I want to talk about it. Now I want to process. And there's so much pain and suffering that's happened because there's this, well, I can't say anything, or the person is high in leadership and they're not going to believe me. And even though we do have a lot more resources now than I'd say 10 years ago, there still is some of this more hidden stigma of, I don't want to be a whistleblower, I don't want to cause any issues, especially depending on the different fields. Some of those I mentioned are maintainers, those who work in maintenance, those who work on the line side, those very high tempo jobs tend to be those where, well, it's been minimized. I did tell somebody, but nothing went with it. And so that does 100% continues to be a very big clinical battleground that we continue to traverse. I want to be open, and I don't have necessarily slides per se to share, because I wanted to be basically a source of questions, or if I can provide that, especially being active duty, knowing that I can't speak for all women, especially their different experiences in the military, but I can definitely share from a clinical perspective. I love what I do. I'm hoping to stay in for the 20 plus years, because as I tell patients, if I could do this for free and have all my bills paid, I would, but unfortunately that's not how it works. So definitely clinical has been my passion. I continue to love it. We work very, very much with a lot of trauma, a lot of cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, EMDR. It's a very, very big component that we see, especially up here in Alaska. Alaska is a rough place to be stationed, as I'm sure if anyone has ever been to Alaska or lives here, you've got darkness, you've got frigid temperatures, very isolated, you're not close to family. And so we do notice that there's definitely a very big mental health trend up here. But please know when we get to the question and answer, I'm an open book. I'm always very, very open to talk about my journey, what's brought me in, what it looks like now and those dynamics, but at least just wanted to give that very brief overview of my background, and especially clinically what I continue to see as I've been working with patients the last several years. And I'll hand it back over to the panelists.
Thank you, Captain Hager. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions based on what you just shared. As a matter of fact, I'm already thinking of a few myself. So we're going to pivot now to our final speaker, Dr. Shaina Townsend.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Shaina Townsend. I am a clinical psychologist, actually. Just recently graduated from fielding in 2023, and I am a psychologist at the Phoenix VA. I work in the primary care mental health integration team, or known as PCMHI. So my job as a staff psychologist in primary care is really to be embedded within the primary care team, and I receive warm handoffs or direct patient consults from the primary care doctors and their staff whenever a veteran comes into the VA and endorses concerns related to mental health, stress, or any risk factors, including suicide, homicide, and also relationship distress. And so normally primary care doctors, we're kind of the first line of individuals who are going to assess the veterans and really kind of determine what their route within the VA's mental health system might look like. So we provide the consults not only to kind of general mental health, but also to PTSD clinic treatment. I'm so sorry, the PTSD clinical team, medical psychology, neuropsychology, and also within our sleep clinical team. And so we really do have to understand the gamut of what the VA system looks like in order to be able to support our veterans and make sure that their care is really the best care that they can receive. Also, just so y'all know, I'm a terrible speaker and my heart's racing, so I apologize for my disruptions in voice. But anyways, in addition to being a VA psychologist, I'm also a veteran myself. I served in the Army for 10 years. I served within a National Guard and a reserve capacity. I did not go on any combat deployments, but I did do within state deployments. So I did primary missions that were in support of deployments overseas. And when I was in the military, I served for my first 4 years as a military police officer, and then my last 6 years were with the military psychological operations teams within Oregon and Hawaii. During my military service, I was present during the don't ask, don't tell policy. And being a bisexual woman married to a woman, it was an interesting time to navigate. I joined when I was 17 and very much not aware of my sexual identity. And that was something that came to fruition through actually my career within the military. In addition to that being part of my experience, I was also privileged to also experience military sexual trauma and also just general sexism that Caroline and also Captain Hager both highlighted. My presentation, which the nerd inside of me had to make a PowerPoint. You can ask Dr. Omrad, who was my chair, that I don't know how to not go above and beyond. But the PowerPoint that I did create, which I will share a little bit for, actually speaks to kind of the impact that some of the different discrimination that women actually experience can have on our mental health. So if it's okay with everybody, I will spend my last 5 minutes going through this. So first of all, I just want to touch base that when we diagnose PTSD, I know that not everyone here is clinical, but we look for 4 primary kind of symptoms, right? We have our intrusive symptoms, our avoidance symptoms, the symptoms that impact our mood and our thoughts, and also the symptoms that impact kind of the way that we react to our environments, also the way that we might be able to sleep and concentrate, kind of that reckless or restless feeling within ourselves. So these are kind of the symptoms that we're looking for. But what's really important, what I want to highlight here is that whenever we're diagnosing or assessing for PTSD, we always want to first ensure that the individual actually experienced a trauma. If you didn't experience a trauma, you can't have PTSD. So what is a trauma? According to the American Psychiatric Association, a trauma is an actual or threatened situation where an individual either directly experiences, witnesses, or learns about a situation where they might experience either death or near death, serious injury, or sexual violence. What's not included within this is a lot of different things, right? So Within a criterion A trauma, we have things like sexual assault and violence, including rape, combat exposure, having your life threatened in a motor vehicle accident per se, or being physically assaulted. But what's not included, and what I think is really critical, especially as clinicians for us to think about, is things like sexual harassment, general harassment. This can include race-based or gender-based harassment, and also discrimination. These are forms of trauma that are not actually considered trauma on a diagnostic perspective. And this is important, right? Why is this important? Well, this is important because female service members and veterans are more likely than their male counterparts to experience these types of situations. They're more likely to experience sexual harassment. In fact, a 2021 report found that 1 in 4 women who serve in the military experience sexual harassment. And 1 in 3 women experience MST, which includes not only sexual harassment, but also sexual assault. And that women have a significantly higher likelihood of experiencing just general harassment based off of their gender and also based off of their race. Not only that, but female service members are more likely to have pre-service trauma experiences, both what we would consider a criterion A and what we would not consider a criterion A, which is really difficult because not only does this impact their mental health as service members, right? These are the women that we're asking to serve our country, to go into combat, to deploy to different areas to support other veterans, but it also can interact with their ability to want to get treatment when they leave the military. Women are less likely to want to receive treatment when they have either had a trauma before entering the military and when they have a trauma experience during their military, whether that trauma experience is considered a criterion A trauma or not. Now, luckily, within the VA system, there are some significant changes that are occurring because this barrier, this significant kind of discriminatory factor that can occur has really come to the attention of providers. And so I do want to just highlight that the VA is working towards really being more inclusive in the services and the things that they do for women veterans. I want to just highlight some of the most specific things that are more recent. More recently, in the last fiscal year, there has been an increase in access to reproductive services. So women are now able to receive reproductive services whether or not they're with a partner who can produce sperm. This is something that has never been available to female veterans before. And this is extremely exciting. In addition to that, MST is now a service-related disability. So women who have a history of MST can receive services through the VA, and all of their services related to MST will be covered for free from the VA. And then also one other thing I just want to highlight just related to this is that the VA is now also increasing family and caregiver support for female veterans, which I think is so exciting. They are actually now rolling out a program where they're going to provide child care services for female veterans so they can actually attend their mental health appointments and get the mental health treatment that they need if child care is a barrier. So I know I'm so sorry if I'm over, but I just want to leave this last thought with you. Please, as clinicians, be considerate when you are assessing female veterans of not only their criterion A traumas, but other things that have happened that likely have impacted and have influenced the mental health symptoms that they are experiencing. And with that, I would like to just say thank you. And thank you for appeasing me in my desire to share my presentation. I think I'm done sharing, but it doesn't look like it, so I apologize. How do I stop? Okay, there it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Townsend. That was an excellent presentation and a wonderful way of explaining the difference between the DSM, if you will, definition of trauma and then non-criterion A trauma. I think there's not a lot of understanding around those differences, maybe even not a lot of acceptance in some circles around those differences. I can think of some that aren't necessarily military related, even in higher education. I think there's still conversations, if you will, around that. So I really appreciate the presentation. At this time, we will be taking questions. I see a hand up, or at least, no, that's my cursor. Please excuse me. So we have some hands up. I was asking people to drop their questions in the chat, if you will. So Anne, if you could put your question in the chat, that would be really helpful. Just because it helps us keep track of what people are doing and saying. Any questions? Let's just give people a few minutes. Excellent presentation, starting with history and then following through. And Dr. Ormerod has a comment here. Fielding is and has been an important educational home for many military-connected learners, spouses, members of those from military families, and we also have a number of alums who work in military-connected occupations, both civilian and military. So lifting that up and letting people know that we have a strong historical connection to the military community. Thank you, Dr. Ormerod. Carl Nelson, hello. I have two questions. Dr. Townsend, did your PsyOps training help your current career path in any way at all? And if so, how?
That's a fun question. So PsyOps, or Psychological Operations Specialist, is kind of a deceiving title because actually we are a bunch of sociologists. We as a collective group actually explore and really learn about cultures and different groups and societies, and understanding things that are going to be helpful for different communities, things that we could offer as gifts or exchanges in order to utilize resources and basically do exchanges. So it didn't so much help me in my one-on-one clinical setting, but I think that it opened the pathway for me to consider psychology because I was also misled. And so I think in that way, it invited me in my undergrad to explore both psychology and sociology, which then led me to psychology.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question in. Captain Hager, was your experience prior to becoming an officer more or less than after you became an officer? Do you feel that being a doctor improved your treatment?
Yeah, I love this question because I think I know kind of the question, the line of that. I definitely felt there was a lot of, prior to coming into the military and not having that background myself, and knowing that predominantly a lot of my background was clinical, very, very heavily clinical. I felt like even though sometimes the military can move very glacially, I felt like I had supervisors or colleagues, especially in residency, that I was able to bring in topics from the civilian side that I think actually did open up, I think, more topics of conversation. I think Dr. Townsend, like what you had mentioned, that PTSD is not clean cut, and it was never clean cut when it was on the civilian side either. And so I know in many conversations I had, not only with my supervisors on the military side, but others who are non-clinical, I can count on both hands the number of times I've talked to commanders and first sergeants and those that are in leadership explaining that, hey, I understand that this doesn't fit the normal criteria for PTSD, but I need you to understand the impact that it still has on someone. Even the concept of moral injury is starting to increase in its awareness in the military. And I can tell you how many times I brought that into a topic of conversation and said, sure, we're not necessarily talking about somebody who's had a direct exposure to, say, a combat zone or watching a comrade unfortunately be killed in combat, but knowing that somebody had to make a call, or I've worked with several combat medics that unfortunately were not able to save everyone in the field, and there's the moral distress of, I'm a medic, I'm supposed to save people, and I couldn't, and they're still having these PTSD symptoms. And so to Dr. Townsend's point, it doesn't necessarily meet criterion A, but we're still seeing the same level of impact on their overall mental health. And so to the question, I think that by coming in on the civilian side and knowing that we had so much breadth, and I know that fielding has that same type of training, I think I at least felt I was able to bring more insight into a system that is so used to it being very cut and dry and saying, nope, PTSD, yes, no. I definitely would say there was a lot of imposter syndrome coming in for those who don't necessarily have a military background, or those that do. Officer, it's very different than enlisted, and I definitely have counterparts that are prior enlisted that they just have such a breadth of information and such an amazing insight into things, where as an officer you're leading people, you're meant to be in leadership positions, and so having an enlisted counterpart that is an officer as well goes, hey, do you know, Captain Hager, you're not supposed to say this certain thing, or that's very personal, or there's a line here, and I'm going, okay, all right, I got to figure this officer thing out. So I would say that there was definitely a big transition period, and I'm still learning. I will say, even after 6 years, there's many times where I will be very real and very raw in a leadership meeting talking about mental health and going, okay, hang on, was that my military bearing? Did that slip, or is that supposed to stay there? And so I'd say there was a lot of positive that I think brought it in for me prior to an officer, but I would still say it didn't fill all the gaps. And so I think the biggest thing is just keeping a growth mentality has been huge. And to the second point of the doctor, I do think it helped improve treatment, because that's what I came in for school for, very clinically heavy. And sometimes where even in this kind of shift in dynamic, I will say a predominant number of those who are mental health providers in the military are predominantly more women. And so when that happens, that sometimes if I'm sitting in a room with a bunch of non-medical people and I'm there to be the voice of psychological health, sometimes it will be okay, well, that's just the psychologist saying the psychologist thing. And so there is this balance where I think from a clinical perspective, individually with my patients, it works wonderfully, and I've seen it be very effective. But then on the military side, there's this friction that can sometimes be there. So it's a yes, no to the second question of, does my doctor improve treatment? Yes, on the individual side, larger grand scheme of things on the military, still traversing that.
Thank you. Thank you. Great questions. Great response. This is a question for all of you, so I'm going to see whose hand goes up first. What individual or systemic receptivity do the panelists see in the effort to shift and or educate perspectives and understanding among long-standing patterns and structures? And the person asking the question is Daniel Calvig. And Daniel, if you want to come off, okay, Carolyn thinks she has a response to you. Great, Carolyn, go for it.
Yeah, well, I have some thoughts, and I think it's worth, acknowledging that my military service is now quite, 8 years ago. So since I'm military, since I was active duty military. That being said, my husband is still active duty. I have a lot of friends who are still active duty. And I am currently in a clinical practicum working with active duty service members. So I'm going to take a stab at this, but I do want to acknowledge that there might be some better insight from those whose military service is a little bit more proximal than mine. That being said, I think it's important to acknowledge first and foremost that the military has its own culture, right? There's very unique social standards, cultural norms, things that are very specific and unique to the military. Anecdotally, I have heard this once, and I have observed it to be true, that military culture tends to lag a few decades behind sort of the rest of the world. So all of the social progress that we observe in the civilian sector is pretty regularly at least 1 or 2 decades, until we see that reflected in military culture. That being said, again, I sort of anecdotally, this just through my own experiences, which have largely been only with the Air Force, watching, my husband participate in these structures. I do feel like there has been quite a bit of progress. There's conversations happening now that I don't think would have happened even during my time in the military. Conversations about where something like victim blaming was kind of the status quo. When someone came forward with an allegation of MST, that seems to be, again, sort of, I've observed that seems to be changing, in that people are being a little bit more conscious of how they are having conversations in leadership when a service member comes forward with these experiences, pausing and challenging each other. Again, it kind of, why are you so quick to defend the alleged perpetrator? Why are you so quick to denigrate the alleged victim? So I think, again, just kind of, there's a little bit more awareness and conversation kind of in these leadership spaces. I also think, and this might be, this might be controversial to say, but I hope not. But I think social media has played an important role here. There are social movements that play out on social media that have led to some pretty direct change. And I'm pretty exclusively at this moment referencing the tragedy of Vanessa Guillen and the well-coordinated social media movement that ultimately resulted in the passing of the Vanessa Guillen Act just a couple of years ago. Now, this was a pretty significant piece of legislation. It came from a horrible tragedy that befell Private or Specialist Guillen, that ultimately resulted in some pretty meaningful change with the way that the military manages or addresses sexual harassment and those investigations. So all of this to say, I think that there has been change. I think that there's more of a space for conversations about how these longstanding, very patriarchal norms and cultures are affecting, not just women, but other minority members, social service members as well. So again, maybe somebody who's a little bit more, current in actual active duty military life could offer some additional observations, but those are just some things that I have observed, and I thought I'd share. So thank you.
Anyone else want to comment? Captain Hager?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had the better news. I don't disagree with Caroline at all, that especially in the last handful of years, I think there's been more of a conversation on introducing us, like mental health specifically, into spaces to have a conversation. I did kind of mention it. I will say it is an adage that you hear in the military all the time, that the military moves at a glacial pace. It does in some ways. And what can be a big challenge that I've noticed on an individual and systemic level, just even at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, as well as my previous base, which was Joint Base Lackland in San Antonio, the receptivity can change depending on the command structure, is very challenging. And for those who don't necessarily know, commanders are not there for years and years. They're there sometimes a few years, 1 year, if you're lucky, 3. And so if you get a very receptive commander who very much wants to push any type of mental health initiative, break down those barriers, ensure people are getting care, awesome. However, when that commander leaves, there can sometimes be the chance that the next commander coming in may not be as receptive. So there's a lot of this type of kind of revolving door that I have noticed in the years I've been in, that I will have that conversation over and over and over again. And where I think that we get very strategic on the mental health side, as I will change my pitch depending on who it is and how receptive it is. And so that can be a challenge. I will definitely say that. And it is very, very frustrating at times when, we've had this great rapport, we've established it with a squadron, and then a new command structure comes in, and then we've got to start all over again. I will say that depending on age as well, when we have individuals who have been in, I would say over 15 years, if not a little bit longer, I do see a little bit more of the, suck it up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I'm great awesome, mental health, do what you got to do, but I don't really want to hear about it. If there's a little bit younger, a little bit less than that, then I do see people who are like, let's get you in, let's do outreach. So it can be very dependent on command structure. I would say in my time, it's been receptive, but as far as actual change, that does tend to be a little bit slower, unfortunately. I still put up the good fight. I will still continue to put up the good fight when that happens, but it definitely is, I can't imagine just as a clinician, that's what I'm seeing. And that does reflect for me to see, then what does my patient see? What types of barriers are they encountering? So it's a hard question because I wish I could tell you that, yeah, it's awesome. It's super receptive. But I would say that in the grand scheme of when we're talking about just traversing, it can be very, very challenging.
Excellent responses to a complex question. There's a comment or a question actually in the chat. What is one misconception about veterans or women veterans that you wish more people understood? And how do you think that affects veterans in the workforce? It's a good question.
Yeah, I'll just share, I guess, some of my experience as a female veteran. So I think for me, I am pretty protective of my identity as a veteran. There is sort of this kind of a weird thing that happens when you separate from the military, and that is that you're really just not part of the club anymore. And it happens instantaneously. You go from being one of the the unit, one of the members, and then suddenly you're very much not. And I think that that process can be a little bit more isolating for women. As Dr. Hager said, there's this experience where you mention that you're military corrected, and the assumption is that it's if you're married to a man, the assumption is that it's your partner, your male partner, who's the one who serves or who has served. And when that assumption is made, there's really not a gracious way to say, well, actually, I served too, without it kind of looking like you're looking now for praise or something to that effect. And that's simply not the case. But I feel like there's that you sort of that experience gets minimized, I think, in a way for women, for female veterans, or at least that's sort of been my experience, that there's not as much space to talk about it without it sort of coming off as you're looking for for validation or something. So as far as an actual misconception, I think that I've read some other experiences of other veterans, and I've heard that people sometimes say that they struggle with the idea that being in the military is a very masculine thing, and that the skills that a woman learns in her time in the military is not as diverse or applicable to other works spaces as the skills that a man might learn. So there's some barriers there. I don't know if that's something that I have personally experienced. Again, I was a medic, so those skills that I learned kind of fell into, those gender stereotypes. I loved my job, and I'm grateful for that experience. But, I don't know if had I worked, as Dr. Hager said, something like a maintainer or, something a little bit more masculine type of a job, if I would have had the experience, as a veteran that some of those women kind of report experiencing. So I think that it's, I think that the misconceptions are, that there's something very, that it's not as important, it's not as honorable, it's not as real in some ways as a man's military service, especially if you did not deploy or see combat, and that can be a little bit frustrating. So yeah, so those are kind of my thoughts there. If you have a female veteran in your family or a friend, I would encourage you to ask her about her service, because it's not a question that we get asked too often, or at least hasn't been in my experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was a very thoughtful answer. And we are almost at time. We have about 5 minutes, and I have just one question that I'd like to share with Dr. Shaina Townsend. You mentioned don't ask, don't tell in your presentation, and I'm curious if things have changed as regards to intersectionality and gender inclusiveness.
That's a great question. When I was in the military, I remember signing the don't ask, don't tell policy twice, which when you're signing that, what you're saying is that you're not going to say that you're straight or gay or otherwise. You're going to pretend like you're just normal. But what is normal, right? So basically you're saying that I'm not going to identify with the part of my identity that's important to me if it digresses from the norm, which then excludes basically every member of the LGBTQIA community. And since, Obama's time as presidency, when, the don't ask, don't tell policy was finally removed, and we kind of entered into this new era where even policies were put into place for individuals who identify as transgender to serve and to actually receive services within the military to be able to transition. I think that these policy changes are extremely exciting and really kind of open up pathways that can definitely be seen as opportunities for more diversity and inclusion. My biggest pause is just really the safety of actually these individuals, because what is not being really discussed is actually the culture of the military and the lack of acceptance that is often found. And then when these individuals are self-identified, they oftentimes face extreme discrimination and harassment in ways that actually make it so that they want to medically discharge and leave. And so I think that policy changes are occurring, but we need to also be considerate and mindful of the culture, both socially and politically, that we are in, and whether these individuals are safe within these structures.
That is a very thoughtful response to that question, and it ties into Jess Hargreaves' question about the culture shift needs to begin to happen. And he's asking, or they're asking about, Jennifer was asking about women of color and in the military and how these differ, how the experiences may differ for their non-women of color peers.
I am obviously not a woman of color, and I will not try to speak from that perspective at all. What I will share is the thing I would have added to the discussion about the misconception of female veterans is that when you see a female veteran going above and beyond and being that reliant, super dependable, extraordinary woman, I want you to ask yourselves, is she doing this because she feels responsible for making sure that everything goes well and that everyone else is pleased and their emotions are being protected? And is she doing this in response to things that she's experienced and the discrimination that she's experienced during her military service? I know from my professional experience, the women of color that I've treated are more vulnerable to having these tendencies to need to people please than their white counterparts. I wonder why that is. I think we can look at society and the ways that we have oppressed women of color that have set it up so that they are more vulnerable to these tendencies. And this is not good for any of their mental health or well-being.
Thank you so much, each and every one of you, Caroline Miller, Captain Hager, and Dr. Shaina Townsend. This was a very insightful conversation. We have many comments in the chat, as well as some questions. Again, this will be recorded and will be posted to the Fielding YouTube. Thank you again, and thank you, participants, for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and remember to take some time out to reflect on our veteran community. Thank you. Bye-bye.